The History of the AMA. February 11, 2012. By Ty Bollinger. Let's put on our history caps and go all the way back to the year 1910 and learn about John D. Rockefeller and the Flexner Report. I'll bet you've never heard of this report, have you? You see, Rockefeller's goal was to dominate the oil, chemical, and pharmaceutical markets, so his company, Standard Oil of New Jersey, purchased a controlling interest in a huge German drug-chemical company called IG Farben. On a side note, IG Farben was the single largest donor to the election campaign of Adolf Hitler. 1 year before Hitler seized power, IG Farben donated 400,000 marks to Hitler, his Nazi party, and his private army, the SS. Accordingly, after Hitler's seizure of power, IG Farben was the single largest profiteer of the German conquest of the world during World War II. While millions of people were being imprisoned and murdered, IG Farben was profiting. IG Auschwitz, a 100% subsidiary of IG Farben, was the largest industrial complex of the world for manufacturing synthetic gasoline and rubber for the conquest of Europe. Auschwitz used the concentration camp prisoners as slave labor in their factory. But there was no retirement plan for the prisoners of Auschwitz. Those who were too frail or too old to work were selected at the main gate of the Auschwitz factory and sent to the gas chambers. Even the chemical gas Zyklon B used for the annihilation of millions of innocent people resulted from IG Farben's drawing boards in factories. In 1941, Otto Armbrust, the IG Farben board member responsible for the Auschwitz project, stated to his colleagues, "Our new friendship with the SS is a blessing. We have determined all measures integrating the concentration camps to benefit our company." The IG Farben cartel used the victims of the concentration camps as human guinea pigs. Tens of thousands of them died during human experiments such as the testing of new and unknown vaccinations. All in all, over 300,000 prisoners passed through the Auschwitz facility. Over 25,000 were worked to death, while countless others were murdered in the gas chambers or by human experimentation. One would think that after the end of the war, due to their participation in the murder of millions of people at Auschwitz, IG Farben board members would have been blackballed by American pharmaceutical companies. Nothing could be further from the truth. Have you ever heard of Bayer Corporation? Of course, you have. In 1956, Bayer appointed Fritz Sturmyer, IG Farben board member and convicted war criminal from the Nuremberg trials, as chairman of its board. Joseph Borkin, The Crime and Punishment of IG Farben. The fruit doesn't fall far from the tree. In the 1980s, Bayer came out with a drug called Factorate, which was for hemophiliacs. However, it was quickly discovered that Factorate, which was made primarily of human blood products, was tainted with the AIDS virus. Despite the fact that internal documents have proven that Bayer knew the drug was tainted with AIDS, they decided to sell it overseas, specifically in France, Spain, and Japan. As a result, thousands of innocent hemophiliacs and their families have been infected with the AIDS virus. This is mass murder. I am appalled beyond words. But I digress. Let's go back to 1910 and back to our history lesson on the Flexner Report. In order to build his drug cartel, Rockefeller needed to re-educate the medical profession to prescribe more pharmaceutical drugs, so he hired Abraham Flexner to travel the country and assess the success of American medical schools. In reality, there was very little assessing going on by Flexner. The results of his study were predetermined. Eventually, Flexner submitted a report to the Carnegie Foundation entitled Medical Education in the United States and Canada. Not surprisingly, the gist of the report was that it was far too easy to start a medical school and that most medical schools were not teaching sound medicine. In other words, they weren't pushing enough drugs. Flexner reported that it was necessary to install a doorkeeper to determine which medical schools were allowed through that medical door and which ones must remain outside. The report was presented to Congress, and they swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. As we see quite often, politicians are quite willing to enact laws that rob us of our constitutional freedoms under the banner of public protection. Just look at what has happened to the USA since the alleged terrorist attacks of September 11th. So the AMA became the new doorkeeper and was empowered to determine which medical schools were properly following the standards of conventional medicine and which ones were not. Contrary to popular notion, the AMA is not a governmental entity. It is a private organization which began in 1847, and it is basically the physicians' union. The only difference between the AMA and the Steelworkers Union is that the AMA members wear white collars, while the steelworkers wear blue collars. And much like many labor unions, at the apex of this organization are the mafia bosses. You see, the predetermined purpose of the Flexner report was to label doctors who didn't prescribe drugs as charlatans and quacks. Medical schools that offered courses in natural therapies and homeopathy were told to either drop these courses from their curriculum or lose their accreditation. Is it any wonder that the total number of accredited medical schools in the USA was cut in half between 1910 and 1944? The end result of the Flexner report was that all accredited medical schools became heavily oriented toward drugs and drug research. Rockefeller's plan was a smashing success, and conflicts of interest between Big Pharma and Big Medicine continue to this day. In his book, Cancergate, How to Win the Losing Cancer War, Dr. Samuel Epstein demonstrates that over the past century, the ACS, NCI, and AMA have all become corroded with major institutional and personal conflicts of interest with Big Pharma. As candidly admitted by a recent NCI director, the NCI has become a government pharmaceutical company. Dr. Epstein also chronicles how, for monetary reasons, the cancer industry is suppressing mountains of information about environmental causes of cancer rather than making this information available to the public. In his book The Politics of Cancer Revisited, Dr. Epstein states that the cancer establishment has also failed to provide the public, particularly African American and underprivileged ethnic groups, with their disproportionately higher cancer incidence rates, with information on avoidable carcinogenic exposures, thus depriving them of their right to know and effectively preventing them from taking action to protect themselves, a flagrant denial of environmental justice. It's a simple economic equation, folks. Keeping the public ignorant about the causes of cancer results in more cancer patients. More cancer patients results in more sales of chemotherapy drugs, more radiation, and more surgery. You see, money, rather than moral ethics, is the deciding factor for the cancer industry and the medical mafia. To be honest, their goal is to provide temporary relief by treating the symptoms of cancer with drugs, while never addressing the cause of the cancer. This ensures regular visits to the doctor's office and requires the patient to routinely return to the pharmacy to refill his prescriptions. This is what the game is all about, folks, plain and simple. Big Pharma is nothing more than a conglomeration of companies that can best be described as glorified drug pushers. Deny it or deal with it. Stick your head back in the sand if necessary. Think happy thoughts. Or keep reading and keep an open mind. It's your choice. I have one request. Please don't disregard the facts contained in this book just because your doctor never mentioned them to you, or because some of them are hard to believe, or because the alternative cancer treatments have been labeled quackery or nonsense by the cancer industry, or because many of them are diametrically opposed to the propaganda you hear on the nightly news. Please try to step outside the box and open your mind to the possibility that you have been lied to and that there are much more effective cancer treatments than the big three: chemo, radiation, and surgery. The late Dr. Robert Atkins put it best: there is not one, but many cures for cancer available. But they are all being systematically suppressed by the ACS, the NCI, and the major oncology centers. They have too much of an interest in the status quo. The survival of the medical mafia and Big Pharma is dependent upon the elimination, by any means, of effective natural health treatments. By making it more difficult to access natural health remedies, these medical gangsters are protecting their monopoly while simultaneously feeding their own megalomania. Truth be told, especially relating to cancer treatments, the medical mafia and their Big Pharma buddies are running a huge extortion scheme, and their tactics make Pol Pot look like a choir boy. Regardless if you are a doctor or a patient, if you cross the medical mafia, then you will likely be visited by one of their leg breakers who will attempt to intimidate and coerce you into submission and obedience. In the words of Dr. Henry Jones, soon after the medical monopoly was formed, it began to push its agenda of destroying all competition. A well-organized and well-funded, nationwide purge of all non-MDs was undertaken. Over the course of the first half of the 20th century, this medical monopoly managed to shut down over 40 medical schools. Their idea was to keep the number of doctors low in order to keep fees up. After WW2, the medical monopoly started rigidly controlling how many of each medical specialty it would allow to be trained. The medical monopoly also managed to outlaw or marginalize over 70 healthcare professions. Protection of the healthcare consumer was, as always, the rationale for this power grab. Whether the object of destruction by the medical monopoly be homeopaths, midwives, chiropractors, or internet prescribers, the purge is conducted in the same manner. No scientific proof or research data is offered to discredit these practitioners. The entire approach is one of character assassination.